Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Training Doyen's live webinar session on HR Compliance 101 for new HR and non-HR managers. My name is Michael, and I will be your host for today's session. On behalf of entire Training Doyen's team, I would like to thank you all for being part of today's webinar. Today's webinar session will be presented by Terry Morning. Let me give you a quick outline on today's proceedings. Today's webinar is for a duration of 90 minutes. I would like to inform all the attendees that once we begin the teleconference, the phone lines will be placed on mute and will remain so until the QA begins towards the end of the webinar session. This to avoid any discontinuity and to make sure all participants attending the session benefit from the same. Now that we all are ready, I would request Terry to take the training from here. Over to you, Terry.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for that nice introduction, and thank you to everyone for dialing in and allowing me to present today. You can see the agenda on the screen in front of you, so I'm sure that you saw that when you signed up, and so no reason to go through that in great detail. I don't know what your job is or your industry is or your role is or your experience level, and so I always kind of take it back to, since it's HR 101, take it back to the level of a new manager. And besides, it's never hurts to review. And so the role of a manager, and hopefully this was communicated when you were promoted, is that your job is to accomplish results through other people. And that's always kind of surprising, because one minute you're promoted because of the fact you were really good at the job you did. And although that job might have involved a lot of other people, it was primarily your job. And then all of a sudden, it's the results of other people that determine whether you're considered a success or not. And what happens sometimes is, today people don't really take that so seriously, and then today everybody's a working manager and has a lot to do, and managing people becomes this peripheral duty that you'll do someday when everything slows down, when in reality that's your primary duty. And when people work for you, yes, you want to be approachable and know everything about your employees, but think of the best coach you had, or the best teacher you had, or maybe you were lucky to have these really, really great parents. They always still had that line of authority, didn't they? And it's largely imaginary. In fact, really, totally, leadership is totally imaginary, because you can always have this spot on the organizational chart that your box is above other people's boxes. But that doesn't, if the idea of leadership is to get people excited about something, hopefully positive, and moving in the same direction, then that's nothing that a box on a chart can accomplish. So that is totally an imaginary concept, if you will. And just because you have a box above other people on the chart doesn't mean you have the respect of those people. It just means your box is on the chart above them, and that you can make decisions about them, but that's about all you can do. So when you think back to these good coaches, these good teachers, these good parents that you had, you always knew where they stood. And good managers have that as well. The role of HR policies and procedures, we don't really in HR sit around writing all these policies and procedures just for grins and giggles. In fact, when there's a new policy come out, there's usually either a law was passed or something happened. And so your HR policies and procedures, you think of those as your playbook. And when you don't follow them, you leave the door open for someone to drive a truck through, basically saying, well, it wasn't because of this business reasons. It was because this, that, or the other. And this, that, or the other is becoming increasingly protected by law these days because we need to have those protections by law. And it creates, and that's kind of your worst case scenario, but your best case scenario when you don't follow the HR policies and procedures, in fact, all of your operational policies and procedures, it creates uncertainty at best, which that doesn't, if you think back to your good coaches, then you always knew where you stood. So they were consistent and they followed the rules. Because when you don't, it's not just inconsistency that makes people feel uncertain and unsafe. And I don't mean like physically they're going to be hit by lightning unsafe, but they just feel kind of off center all the time. It can create an image of unfairness and also double talk that you don't do what you say you will. And so there's nothing you can depend upon, and that's the best case scenario. And then the worst case scenario is you wind up in front of a jury and they're wondering why, if they're your own policies and procedures, why the company didn't follow them. So there must be some mysterious reason why. It's probably not a good one. And lastly on that, when you don't follow the policies and procedures, you'll often hear people use the term, "Oh, I broke that policy." Well, you didn't break that policy. What your actions did may have had the effect of creating new policy. And you certainly want to make sure that it is within your pay grade to have that authority to make new policy without asking anybody else first. And if it is in your pay grade, you probably already know about it. So if you have to stop and think about that, I wonder if I could break that policy. Well, there's a reason for it. So sometimes, policies, they're always under review, and sometimes they don't get written exactly the way you meant them to, and things change and business change, so they're always under review. So if a policy is not working for you, go to somebody who does have that authority, such as your supervisor or HR, and ask them about that and say what your situation is before you take some action that has the effect of creating new policy. Because maybe there's a reason to do something differently, or maybe it's time to change the policy. Documentation. We're going to talk about documentation here in a minute. And one of the things to think about when it considers documentation is that all of the paperwork that you create during your tenure as a manager for that company is company documentation. So there is no such thing as having a personal supervisor's file of personnel records, or whatever you want to call it. I call them shadow files. And now you do have to keep a file on your employees, and because you have to keep track of things like what you want to talk to them about, and performance observations, and good things they did, and things they need to improve upon, and vacation schedules, and maybe even you have to keep track of attendance to some extent. So you do have to keep a file, but don't think that that's a personal file. Don't think that's your file. That was generated out of and during your course of employment, and it is subject to the highest levels of confidentiality of any records in your organization. And so you probably have an informational policy there. And so HR records is in the top tier, and they say things like don't take them home and confidentiality and that type of thing.